Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah. I'm with the Midwest Writing Center, and I'm super excited today to have Tamar Marie Boyadjian with us. I'm going to talk faster than that from now. If you are not familiar with this program, here's what it tends to look like. We're going to have a awesome conversation with Tamar, and then I will give updates on the Midwest Writing Center, things that we're up to, things that we're invested in. And then we will provide a free write prompt at the end. It'll be about an hour, maybe a little more. I am deeply interested in Tamar and her work, so it's possible that I make this a much longer process than it usually is. Now, here we go. Tamar Marie Boyadjian is an internationally recognized and award-winning author, Western Armenian poet, editor, and translator. She writes about medieval Armenian literature, the ethics of endangered language translation and preservation, trauma and testimony, and the role of women writers in Western Armenian literary history. She's also a fantasy writer who will be authoring a fantasy series in Western Armenian for young adults to be published by RP Publishing. She's currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, Tamar.
Thanks, Sarah, for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm crazy excited. I know, like, this is a problem I have where I kind of do whatever I want with this show. So like, I'm always very excited, and I think that I probably end up sounding like, a marketing person. But I'm so excited. This is a topic I'm particularly invested in. You work it's specifically in areas that affect me, and you're a genius. So
thank you so much for that.
I need to make a note for myself real quick. Okay. So just to kick off, get straight to the meat and potatoes.
Let's do it.
How did you get into this field as a whole? This field, I guess, in this moment means creative translation and preservation of language.
Oh, well, I've been wanting to be a writer since I was very young. And I think I was lucky because I was always surrounded by books. My grandparents' home, where I spent a lot of my time as a child, and my parents' home, and just coming from a family of artists and creators, it was almost, I guess, inevitable. And I'm really happy about that I ended up being an artist myself and a writer. But it kind of all started with a fascination for the medieval world, being a kid, loving fantasy, reading Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and then being like, there's something off. Like I don't actually connect to these characters. Like there's some cultural thing that doesn't feel like it's about me or my family or my ancestors. And so I kind of got super obsessed as a kid with fantasy literature, and then went to school, and of course, like all of us, tried to not do the thing that we loved for a while.
They told me it wouldn't make money.
Yeah. And then we're like, that just sounds like a miserable life. So I'm just going to do the thing that I love. So I remember actually dropping organic chemistry, declaring English as my major, and deciding that nothing wrong with organic chemistry, by the way, but I just did not get it. And just decided that I was going to investigate what the Armenian medieval world looked like. Because I'm Armenian and I want to know what this looks like, because I keep reading about how the European medieval world looks like. And I'm very curious about how Armenians lived in the Middle Ages, how, my parents being from Lebanon, like what did, the Swana communities and the Swana region and the Mediterranean look like? And, lo and behold, I found out we had this amazing Armenian kingdom and all, a great and rich history and literature. And so I started writing poetry at a young age in English, and also that felt very unsatisfying. It always also felt like there was a disconnect between what was going on in my mind and what I wanted to put on the page. And so even though I dabbled writing in English, and I still do, I felt like I had to write in both languages. And so writing in Western Armenian was something that I started also at a young age and continued to, kind of pursue as I went to school in high school. And I was very, very lucky to have three. So I went to Armenian private school in Los Angeles. And I was very lucky to have three very inspiring teachers that kind of fulfilled that different artistic parts of me. An English teacher, Marilyn Ashraguni, who I spoke a lot about medieval English literature and, romantic literature with. And then Roger Kupelian, who's a brilliant graphic novelist, special effects guy, writer, visionary, and Ara Kazanjan, who is also a Western Armenian poet and probably one of the most influential people for me and the fact that I write in Western Armenian, because from a very young age he really motivated me to continue writing, especially when I felt as a learner of Armenian, as a young learner, even though it was my first language, I really didn't feel sometimes like I was at the level to be writing creatively. And so he was someone that really pushed me to continue to write. And so.
You mean with your mastery of the language?
Yeah, exactly. And also just like a poetic form, pushed me to read literature in Armenian, think about what it means to be a writer, in addition to just writing. So I'm very grateful to all of them for their influence in my life at a young age.
That's really beautiful. I'm really envious. And I'm realizing for the non-Armenian folks who may be tuning in with us, hopefully are also invested in the preservation of endangered languages and cultures. There are two Armenian languages that we're probably going to be referencing, and we reference them as either Eastern or Western Armenian. And Western Armenian is the endangered language, the more endangered language.
Yes, and Western Armenian is the language that was spoken across the Ottoman Empire, and basically it's under threat because of the Armenian genocide, which happened in 1915, but started with massacres early in the 1890s across the region. And so that community of Armenians that survived were deported through the Syrian desert, came into the Swana regions where they still had to maintain the language. And then because of a series of wars, obviously, that we know about in the Middle East, then left and went to parts of Europe and America where the preservation of that language continues, but is still under threat. And I guess it's important to acknowledge here in our conversation today, too, the current situation in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, the continuous ethnic cleansing of the Armenian people in the region, and the loss of indigenous lands as a result of war and persecution from Turkey and Azerbaijan.
Thank you. You summed that up really well. And also, we're digging, 6 questions in here instead of 2. But something that I've been thinking about that's been rolling around in my brain forever, but particularly with the current ongoing active ethnic cleansing, is that when a people loses land, they end up in a different land, right? And they're in a land in which their language is not spoken. They're in a land in which their culture is not dominant. And so that's like a very quick way to lose both culture and language, and they intersect. And so genocide in general, as it pertains to Western Armenian, is a huge reason for that. But then it's ongoing in and with any culture that experiences loss of land.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, of course, this can align with theories around colonialism across the Americas and Africa. One thing I want to acknowledge is that Western Armenian is obviously part of hundreds of languages that are endangered today in the world. Western Armenian is considered endangered 1, or definitely endangered. But a lot of the work that I do, I hope to keep in conversation with African writers and Indigenous American writers who are also struggling with similar issues, being writers of endangered languages, being impacted by colonialism, being impacted by genocide, right? And being impacted by ethnic cleansing.
That's awesome. What I assume that you're just doing that as a matter of course with your work and with the things that you're invested in as a human being. and this is not a question I was prepared to ask, so bear with me. What do those conversations look like? What is it like to engage with, I don't know, folks who understand?
That's an interesting question. I think a lot of endangered writers still write in isolation. When you're composing a creative piece as an endangered writer, there's a very different intention there, right? The intention is purely preservation of language. And then you're lucky enough to get creative with that language. If you're lucky, you'll have like 5 to 10 readers of your book. So it's not like writing creatively in a modern European language, where the idea of dissemination of your work is really like, your goal, and the idea of a huge readership at your hands. So I think we still, as endangered writers, and I can't speak for other cultures, but for those of Western Armenian, are still writing in a sense of isolation. We're still writing with hopes of, we have issues in publishing, we're still writing in hopes of finding an audience and a readership. And then we have the ethical question, of course, of translation. Do you translate your work? Well, the idea of writing in the endangered language, right, is the hope of maintaining the language. But then to get the message across, you must translate to a major European language. And I think one of the pioneers that talked about this is, Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his work. And he talked about, at a point where he decided he's not writing in his, indigenous, he's not writing in English anymore as the colonial language. He's writing in his indigenous Kenyan dialect. And, other writers like Leslie Mormon Silko, right, talks about that in terms of indigenous writers of America. So, and especially being a woman. So I think these conversations are what I keep in mind, because it allows me as a writer of Western Armenian to find an audience for my work, even though that audience is not necessarily a readership of my work, right? But it's like they're comrades in a fight that I'm fighting. And so that kind of solidarity, I think, is something we need more of, and something that I'm working more towards, is to create a community of not just Western Armenian, because we're so few, but not just Western Armenian writers, but writers of endangered languages that are struggling with similar kinds of issues and internal torments as we write our creative pieces.
So this is, I think the way that this conversation came to be between us, and why I got so excited to hopefully share your insights with a larger number of people, was that in my own thinking, in my own writing, whatever that means, I had never even considered the use of meaning using Western Armenian, though that is the language of my family, because what I had been thinking was very utilitarian. If I want to go to Armenia, the useful mode of communication would be Eastern. If I want Armenians to read my work, the useful mode of communication would be Eastern Armenian. And you blew that apart for me, and I'm so grateful. And there's been a lot of crying about it, in a good way, of course, because of the potential for damage of keeping that ideology, or not questioning it at the very least, has been so it's been such a catalyst for me, and changing the way that I think in general, but also in the way I think that it's very useful to introduce this idea to anyone we can, that like, when we think in this utilitarian way, when we think of communication as a utilitarian verb, utilitarian action, we're denying all of the nuance and all of the art and all of the culture that comes with language, that comes with communication. There's not a question there. I'm just really excited.
Yeah, no. And I mean, if we think about the basics of semiotic theory that talks about the expression of subjectivity and language, one of the major impacts of colonialism, of course, was that it didn't allow the people, right, to express themselves in their own language. So when you're using the register of another people, like major European, let's say, languages as a mode of expression, you're already, right, theories of translation already tell us, right, that we have lost a sense of meaning, right? We have lost deep-rooted meaning in that transference. And so that kind of linguistic imposition is problematic, because it doesn't get to the core of that culture and really the organic ways in which that culture would express itself, right? Even in simple terms. Yeah.
That's my so I handwrite this, which because I told you that I handwrite my questions. And now my notes are all over the page. Like I've got like terms and like full phrasing, and then also things I want to come back to or remember. And it's the messiest piece of paper you've ever seen.
Looks like my notebook.
I hope so. It would be an honor. I wanted to go back to you talking about learning in the field of English, and then we often say English, and what we mean is literature versus language, I guess. But having culturally relevant, culturally similar teachers to you, can you talk about how that, I mean, I guess you don't know, but can you maybe speak to how that is different from learning in, say, I went to public school. All of my English teachers that I can think of were white. All of them were born in the US. All of them grew up in this American canon, studied this American canon, and introduced to me the American canon. Right. So I imagine having a teacher from a similar background makes a difference in how you're absorbing those things, and then also what else you see in that realm.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably why I have an accent, even though I'm born in America when I speak English. I don't know how much I could speak to the English part, but I would like to speak to the learning of Armenian, actually, if that's okay. Yeah, and I think, I think that the trajectory of learning Western Armenian has changed a lot in the last several decades, but learning it at a time and learning a language that is a preserver of memory and a preserver of trauma naturally is an extension of that trauma. And what I mean by that is, when we learned Western Armenian in school and they told us like, speak Armenian, don't speak English, don't speak the foreign language, right? We understood why they were telling us that, right? Our grandparents were survivors of genocide. Our parents were survivors of war. And I think, we were supposed to be the generation that could heal from that. And this was an interesting conversation I had with a few colleagues recently. And I think the problem now is with the situation in Artsakh and Armenia, we feel like we're actually not healing from it, but becoming re-traumatized by the ethnic cleansing, right? Because it was like, oh, our grandparents' generation had survived genocide. That's so far from us. That's 100 years ago. We are now going to heal our communities. And now we're kind of experiencing it as something that's new and raw. But I think that kind of idea of trauma extends to the learning of language, because Western Armenian, for the most part, becomes a sanctified place, becomes a language of purity, right? Even though, of course, Western Armenian and Middle Armenian come from the insertion of Turkish and Arabic, and 80% of the Armenian language in the classical form is argued to be from Parthian Persian. So there is no obviously pure language here, but there is a sense of purity or keeping the language pure and sacred. So what happened is that Armenian or Western Armenian became associated with a certain register, like a perfectionism, a patriarchy. You know what I mean? I say that because it's associated oftentimes, and I would like to talk about this, with purely male writers of the period that stop in the 19th century. They stop at the 20th century. They stop with the genocide, right? So that kind of association as a child with the language and trauma and learning it and speaking in a perfect way, standing upright when you're speaking Armenian, right? But playing in the playground in English. I think that kind of registers of language. And as we know, our brain has registers of language. Like if we learn a foreign language, for example, we can't maybe even talk about the weather in that language, right? Because there's certain intricacies in a language that become so detail oriented, or as they call kitchen language, right? The hardest thing to learn in a foreign language is the kitchen language, like the language spoken in the kitchen. So I think this created a cycle of learning the language that became very difficult for the generation of Armenian language learners in America, and I think continues to be, because it doesn't become a language of play. It doesn't become a literature that's accessible, and it becomes something that remains in the past and not the present. And so one of the hopes that I have as a Western Armenian writer today is to create literature that is kind of palpable to the children and language learners today, that can connect to our lives today as a source of what literature is supposed to do, right? An extension of life, and not something that existed 100 years ago, right? Though I believe that drawing from that is important as part of not forgetting the trajectory of where Western Armenian comes from. But I think with language and the themes, it's like, it's okay to write in Western Armenian about love. It's okay to write in Western Armenian about pain. And not every poem in Western Armenian has to be a poem about nation or a poem about survival, right? And I think that was lacking in the ways that we learn the literature and the language. And particularly, it was lacking because we didn't read enough women writers.
It was really, oh, there were so many things in that was so beautiful. Shoot. Okay. What's really exciting and interesting and like upsetting about this is that there's that combination of preservation of what I know as a refugee who was displaced, and also assimilation for their children. I think we both, our grandparents were the refugees, if I'm okay.
Oh, my parents are not. My parents are born in Beirut.
In Beirut, but not. Yeah. Yeah. You get it.
Yeah.
So our the immediate refugees are doing everything they can to hold on to home, even if that's like a misremembering, right? And then their children are doing their best to assimilate, which I guess you maybe don't have that same problem as I do. Hoping family doesn't see this now. And then, we're coming back and trying to say, okay, but like, how much of this memory is accurate? How much of this memory, I mean, we want to honor all of it, but how much of this memory do I honor? And then how much has already disappeared? And then you're bringing in, I'll say as a patriarchal state, though we know that like Christianity changed a lot of things. You're right. What we're getting is this very like specifically centered stories, these specifically centered language. And it feels kind of like, I'm sure you know this, that French has rules about what's allowed to happen to language, though we know that language is a living organism that changes with each speaker. Language belongs to those who use it. And so that like that deep interest in preservation from those who are most immediately displaced can sort of damage the abilities of language.
Yeah. And I think it works off, sometimes that works paradoxically, because, if a language learner is now feels that they have to perform in this language perfectly, they most likely will attempt it a few times, but then totally disregard it, right? And I want to mention here the work of the Harai Varaz, who's an author who writes these Twitter poems, and completely there's a complete like a disregard, I mean, not in a negative sense, but intentionally, for spelling and for Eastern and Western. And so I think, Harai's work really talks about how it's important to use Armenian in any way that we can. And I think that's a really, really interesting approach, because I also think for a language learner to want to feel motivated to continue to learn the language, and feeling like they have to continue to use it in utilitarian ways, but also with play, as I was saying earlier. So going to what you're saying, I think it's true. I think that if we kind of put this language in a pedestal, we kind of expect a perfectionism from it. If we are constantly correcting or constantly criticizing, really there can be no productivity in want or motivation to want to continue to engage with that language.
Let's get real sad about it.
I mean,
Okay.
it is a, it is a sad place. It's a sad place to be. It's a sad place to think about writing a book in an endangered language that, you know, as a writer, it's so you have the audience that reads your book, and then you have the audience that criticizes your book, especially being an experimental writer. So already the language is endangered. And then here comes someone like me who's like, okay, let's deconstruct this whole thing, right? Let's break this down into pieces. Let's do some visual poetry with it. Let's do some concrete poetry with it. And then let's reconstruct it as a metaphor for survival, right? And of course, you can imagine that I've gotten so many different kinds of responses for that work, from this is great and it's revolutionary to this is awful and you're totally, spitting on the Armenian language. But for me, it's like, oh, you read my book. That's great. You know what you actually read my book. I mean,
You
so
engaged and the
yeah,
language
you
happened
engaged in
and
the
you were
language, no matter what your opinion. And I think all of that is really important, but it is a sad place to write from, because you have people that can't read the language that appreciate the effort. And then you have people that can read that language that sometimes are criticizing the effort, right? But it's a fulfilling place for me as a writer. And I think, we're on a writing show and we're talking about writing. And I think that writing should be fulfilling. It should bring fulfillment. And if that's what you're doing, and you know what I mean, and you have even a few people in the world that are appreciating what you're doing, then for me, that's enough personally, and if I have to, intensely translate something for someone that I really care about to read it, then that means something to me too, So
I'm really grateful that you said that writing should be fulfilling. That's the most important thing for me. Our tagline as an org is write more light into your life, which is where the video series came from, or the
yeah,
name of it.
makes sense.
And that's as an organization, like our number one belief is that this should be fulfilling. This should fill you. This should bring you joy or sustenance, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And also, you said when you started out writing in English, it didn't feel right.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you more about that, because you were primarily speaking English at the time, right?
So I spoke Armenian in the house, and I spoke Armenian and English at school, but I was not I spoke Armenian in the house. That was like kind of like a rule and something we adhered to.
So, and I realized you were a child, right? So what motivated you then to use English?
Because I really loved English literature, and so when I made this kind of when I pivoted toward like medieval lit and reading King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and all the romances and Robin Hood, I was like, what does it feel like to write in English? So I think, when we start off as artists, we intend to initially mimic the things that we right. And so when I started reading the romantic poets like Byron, and Keats and Wordsworth, I was like writing like a romantic, so it's our journey in writing. And I think initially we just like to mimic the writers that we like, or the writers that we're kind of engrossing ourselves in as we're writing. So I think if I remember, it was really me trying to write like fantasy romances, being influenced by the English stuff that I was reading, but then feeling like there's something missing, like when I'm writing this, but I'm also a great proponent of using any language that makes you feel good. But like any language that helps you express your ideas. So a lot of my work is multilingual. And so I have pieces that are I have one piece on light that uses 11 languages, so it's just, I think if there's a word in another language that will allow you to express that, then I think you should use it, and tap into
That's
the source.
so beautiful. And something I think both non-writers and also, I don't know, a certain like brand of writer is less inclined to believe or talk about is that like there is something ineffable, if you will, about the process of making art. And if we're not leaning into the thing that feels right when we're creating it, like, one, why? But two, what's what's the goal then? Or like, why are you, I mean, I said why, but like, why are you writing if it's not making that spark? And so when you said it didn't feel right to write in English, I was very excited that you used that feeling word, right?
Yeah.
Because that's, at the end of the day, I think the only important piece of writing advice is to write what comes, how it comes.
Yeah.
It makes me happy. I'm going to pivot a little bit into translation, if that's
Sure.
okay.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
So I've been thinking, I recently was able to have the opportunity to meet with a few of the people in the MFA in Literary Translation program at the University of Iowa. The translation workshop is having its 60th anniversary this year. Next year is the MFA's 50th anniversary. It's a
Yeah,
big,
that's
beautiful thing going on over there.
a wonderful program they have there. An amazing.
So I've been speaking with a lot of translators lately. And one of them, who I'm hoping I'll have on the show sooner or later, is a Kurdish woman who the Kurds don't have a land, right? And she translates in Farsi.
Right.
And yeah, she's from Iran. We talked about, her she's a little uncomfortable with her language skills with Kurdish. But then talking about like what it means to have those stories accessible to a wider audience.
Right.
I guess I didn't need any of this background information, but I like to have context. So when you think about preserving language, I assume that is different from preserving story. And I know that you've done some work with translation into and out of Western Armenian. What comes into play? Like, what are your priorities when you think about translating from an endangered language?
Yeah, that's a really important and deep question. So most of the work that I do in translation recently and that I've devoted myself to doing is Armenian women writers that have been disregarded in their work. And I'm very happy to say and honored that I received the International Armenian Literary Alliance grant for the transition of Zabelia Sayan, our great writer, Four Mothers, first novel, Spaskan Sarai Med, or In the Waiting Room, which tells the story of Ava, and who lives in Paris, and basically needs to continue going to the waiting room to get milk for her child because she can't produce breast milk. It's really, for me, important now to continue to translate women writers. But before I get into that, I'll say a few things about just Western Armenian and translation. So, like you said, I really like how you put that. So there's the intention of the creative writer to write and produce in Western Armenian. But then the translator's intention, perhaps, is to disseminate the stories of Western Armenian to a wider audience, primarily, in my case, using English. And this was a struggle ethically for me for a while, because, as we all know, the notion of translating an endangered language to a colonial language, how do you feel? How are you not the person that is contributing to its oppression by doing that, right? So how do you kind of think about, well, okay, so I'm at this dilemma. The Armenian can't be read by a wider audience. I have to put it in a colonial language. How am I going to do that by keeping the integrity of the story, the language, and kind of not giving into a colonialist kind of narrative or project? And so I really grappled with this for a long time until I started reading some books around translation. And I realized that ultimately any translator at some point or another, I think, comes to terms with the fact that you're actually really not translating everything or anything, perhaps, because to move from one language to another, there is always exists a gap. And that gap cannot be covered. It can't be closed. There's always going to be a meaning that is not transferred. And so traditionally, we think of translation as a prescriptive, one word to another word, one sentence to another sentence, one notion or idea or storyline to another. And of course, none of us love these translations, because when we look at the source language and we look at the language it's coming to, they barely make any sense, right? Because we lose meaning, we lose idioms and all that. So I said, okay, if I think of a translation not as an intellectual person who's prescriptively transferring language, but as a creative writer, then one, I acknowledge I'm never really translating anything. And two, I acknowledge that I'm actually creating a story based on another story in a new language. So I think of translation as creative writing. And, there's a very interesting book by Antoine Berman called The Experience of the Foreign. And I really love one of Berman's theses or main thrusts, which is that by translating to another language, we're oftentimes thinking about, okay, the loss of what's the meaning, right? Like what are we losing, for example, in Western Armenian if we go to English? But what Berman is proposing is that what are we gaining in the original? And I really like that idea, because if I think about Western Armenian, if I'm living in those words, if I'm breathing those words, if I'm really thinking about how to transfer meaning or ideas or a story, it actually gives me a lot on the original language. And one example I bring up here is, so this translation that I'm doing of Spasman Sarai Mech in the waiting room, I'm working in a very interesting way with Dr. Maral Akhtomakian and Dr. Rachel Goshkarian. And so what we're doing is actually, when we're translating, we've realized and come to understand that Zabel is actually creating a language of women in her book. And what I mean by this is there's a whole register of Western Armenian that applies to women going to the hospital, getting birth milk, a whole register of thinking about, how these women used kind of Armenian in womanly circles. It's really coming to fruition that this book is actually written for women, right? It's written for mothers. And so this is one way, for example, in my experience, where we could see something positive from translation rather than our presupposed ideas of kind of the destruction and loss that comes in that transference. I mean, Schlegel says, for example, translation allows the mother tongue to play. And I really like that too, because if I'm thinking about something in another language, instead of thinking about how I'm moving away from the mother language, I could think about how I'm actually allowing that to play with another language. And so these are kind of images and metaphors I use when I'm, working between, let's say, Western Armenian and English. And I've done some German translations too, but not so much. I like to think about the translation as a new story. I like to think about it as a new creative piece. And so I think, as opposed to other translators, for this reason, I also take more liberties with the original than maybe other people would do or agree with. So that's one caveat to kind of my way of thinking about translation.
Would you say that the story which exists in women's spaces, that's sort of a branch off of kitchen language?
Yes, perhaps. Yeah, perhaps. I think it's yes, I like what you're saying there. I also think it's a branch of a language that is passed on by women. There's, a genealogy of knowledge that is passed on by women. And so, returning to a point I was making earlier, I imagine what my experience would be like in school, in grade school, if I was introduced to more Armenian women writers. Because predominantly we read 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century men, who most of which died from either tuberculosis or died in the genocide. But I think about what my experience would be as a young girl, and this is my motivation as a woman. If I had read more of those women writers, if I was able to gain the knowledge that they were passing down in their writings at such a young age, just like I value the knowledge that I gained from my grandmother or my mother, right? So yeah, I do, and I think that there's something really there that's very ancient, that's very ritualistic, and languages encompass meaning within them. People talk about Sanskrit and other languages, right? So our language, Armenian, it was an oral language. It's a language that existed, we claim, for over 3,000 years, that only got written down, right, in the early 5th century. But it was a language that survived in oral form and had an oral tradition. So there is knowledge there. There's knowledge that's been passed down. And so language is not only about written language, right? It's about kind of the tradition of myth and mythology too, that carries all these ancient kind of ruins within its letters, within its sounds.
That's so beautiful. I think that's also a really good segue to your current project, which I have 1,000 more questions for you, but I really want to talk about your current project. I think it's really the culmination of all of these ideas. And also, I think people should know about it and get excited with me. So can you give a synopsis? I'm not going to ask you to be brief because I feel like it's very complicated, and it should be, of your upcoming book, and then we'll dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, so I just finished a book. It should be coming out next year, hopefully. And it's about the very thing I just spoke of. It's about the lost and forgotten Armenian women writers. It's about the genealogy of knowledge and history of women writers in my family, and then, you know, being the grandchild of a genocide survivor and not being able to trace that genealogy farther than I think my great grandmother on my paternal side. It's about adopting these Armenian women writers as my foremothers, as my grandmothers, and thinking about a futuristic way of the survival of Western Armenian and Western Armenian literature. The book is also a kind of criticism of biography as a patriarchal system of creating stories or narratives about people. So it celebrates the Armenian goddesses of the pantheon with 5 super important, but also other important women writers who were editors of very significant periodicals that ran from the late 19th century to the early 20th century in Istanbul. And that's Guitar, Artemis, Haygin, and Yerdasat Hayui. So Guitar was won by Elbis Gespatsian, and then Gesaratsian, sorry. Artemis was Mari Belerian, and then Haygin was Hayganush Mark, and then Yerdasat Hayui was famous writer Sinan Seza. So it's kind of a experimental work that looks at poetry, prose, and intertwines all these histories. It also includes memories from childhood. It reimagines the past of a young girl who is exposed to these women writers at a young age, whose knowledge of Armenian culture and language and literature is predominantly, achieved, or the avenues through which it's achieved is from Armenian women writers. And so it rewrites up history in order to imagine a future where these writers are present and where there exists a community and a trajectory of Western Armenian literature and Western Armenian women writers. So there's like letters that, you know, a little girl is writing to some of these writers and things like that. So it's a multi-genre kind of book. Yeah.
What's so exciting about this is we see, I mean, there's a lot of things that are really exciting about this, but we see, and we can thank Afrofuturists for bringing to us this this ability to imagine ourselves as, you know, folks of a non-dominant culture in a place of peace and comfort and safety and future for our own people, for our own cultures.
I'm highly influenced as a writer by Afrofuturists and Indigenous futurists, because I think that there are very similar struggles to thinking about diaspora, to thinking about trauma, genocide, and then imagining a future where you acknowledge that trauma, but it doesn't handicap you, right? It allows you to continue to think about a community, a nation, right? Yeah, absolutely.
So your book will first come out in Western Armenian, is that correct?
Yes, and then I will have an English translation of this book. Yes,
I can't wait. Obviously, obviously, I'm very excited to learn, the language of my people. But I will probably always be much more better at at English with English, much more better at. Just to really prove my point.
Well, I mean, talking of
And
translation.
I know I know that this book has gone through several iterations and several goals, and you got to this place um where it felt right, right? Like the book
Yeah.
became the thing it's supposed to be. Do you, and you don't have to, but do you want to speak to that process and how that change happened and why this is the best iteration of it?
I mean, I'm hoping it's the best. Of course, as writers, we're talking to writers here, like we're never fully satisfied with what we do. And there are moments where we want to just burn our writing or throw it in the trash. And I think I'm at a place where I'm satisfied enough with it.
Well, that's enough.
Yeah, I think one of the other things, the great learning experiences for writing this book was the at first I felt a lot of pressure to even align myself with some of these great writers, to even think about that my words in Western Armenian as a woman writer could be spoken of as part of the trajectory of their writing, because I see them as a link and a thread to what I'm doing. And it's not something that I'm writing separate from them. It's something that is a continuation and in praise of them. But then I realized that, and through the support of very important friends and colleagues, that I just really had to be myself. And there was a fear in the writing, as we all know, as writers, right? We're always confronting our fear. But there was a fear in expressing that so blatantly for some reason, as if I owned that, it would be unhumbling of me to say these things. And so I think working through that in the writing was very powerful, to a point where I was like, look, this is where I am. And I'm not saying I'm them, but I'm saying I'm me, right? And I'm saying that I want to say things about them, and I want to talk about my experience of them. And I want to talk about how their writing could make me and others after me better at what we do by creating this bridge between the past and the future. And so that was one big victory for me in the editing process, actually. And being able to come out with some more of that process and my relationship to the women writers of the past, and my projected relationship to hopefully a ton of Armenian women writers in the future.
I'd like to note just the nature of genocide means that some of what survives is dumb luck. Well, some of it is intentional preservation, as a poor analogy, we have Beowulf, which has spanned half of all of written history. But we have no idea if that was anyone's favorite story. We just know it survived, right? So especially what survived of women writers seems intentional, like it's less dumb luck, because just the access to men at the turn of the century was, sorry, I said turn of the century and realized like we have two of them in memory right now. It was just there was more of it, and so more of it was going to last.
Yeah, and I think to add to your point, when we think about Said argues this about Orientalism, but we could think about it in terms of all colonialism, is that the epistemology, right, and the ontology is what chooses, for example, what we consider the canon, right? And so we have epistemologically, white colonial like people making choices about what is considered great literature, and that also over time, right, recycles itself into the mode of what survives.
Yeah.
Disregarding also women writers, or what others or white men considered like the important women writers, right, according to them. Yeah.
This is an aside, but I inherited some books recently, from someone who retired as a professor, and there was an anthology in there, and I don't remember what the anthology was. I want to say it was an early 80s edition, and on the cover it said newly expanded to include women.
Wow. Well, we're so honored.
I just I almost kept that book because of how
As proof.
because of just the audacity.
Yeah, I mean, we're laughing, but it's, I think we're laughing for a different reason.
Yeah. So I'll try and have a final question though. Honestly, if you want to keep talking, I'll keep talking. As an artist, um, where do you find yourself creating with this? Like I know I can't just ask a question. I know that you write and translate your work that you create daily. But where do you find yourself most moved? And maybe this is just like a today thing and not an always thing. As an artist with your creative work, where do you find yourself most moved? Whatever that means to you.
Wow. Well, first, a long time ago, I realized that if I don't write every day, I'm not whole. So writing every day is already something that moves me because it helps me feel whole. And so a long time ago, I realized that if I don't write every day in the morning, I don't feel whole because life will come and insert itself into those spaces. And then next thing you know, it's later in the afternoon and your guilt starts creeping in and now you're like almost disabled and you can't write. So for me, carving out the space to write every day is what moves me. And then if I'm lucky enough to write something moving, then I feel glorious.
I love that. I love to ask people why they write, but I felt like your work is so it's more than writing. Like you engage so much with so much that I didn't want to limit it to that, but that was still the answer. That was really beautiful.
Yeah.
What did I miss? What do you want to share with us? Is there anything
Uh,
else?
what did I miss?
I mean, I have a lot more questions, but I don't want to take up
I
too much of your
I
time.
think one thing I think about or say in this book too is, with the Armenian genocide, I claim or I call Western Armenian an orphan language.
Mm,
And I believe that our Armenian women writers that survived the genocide, those names that I mentioned and many more that are undocumented or we haven't discovered, cradled or adopted or this language, Western Armenian, and brought it to its survival. And for me, this point is really important to make because it's a point that has kind of been disavowed. It's kind of been neglected. And so if we think about the history and survival of Western Armenian, we can't ignore the Armenian women that wrote pre-genocide, post-genocide, in across Swana regions, how they carried this language, they cradled this language. And so this book is a testament to that as well. And it's a way to honor that as women, them as women and as mothers. And
I
so I
wrote
think
down the orphaned language is nurtured by its caretakers.
that's right. So I hope to be part of that trajectory of caretakers of Western Armenian. I see my role with the language as a caretaker. It's to me the most powerful, but yet most, sensitive language. And I do cradle it and I imagine holding it softly and with such care because it needs such care, but there's so much with it that could be said and there's so much that it can empower. Um, so I think that, and I get that from the sense of reading women writers because that is what they did. And so so back to your question about what moves me, I feel honored that I could write in this language every day. I feel honored that I'm able to express myself in this language. And I feel honored by anyone that wants to read what I have to say in it.
So beautiful. Thank you so much. What I especially like about this orphaned language and nurturing it is how it interacts with the other thing that I like to say, which is that language belongs to those who use it. Um, and preservation is more than preserving, right? It's nurturing and facilitating and
And respecting,
yeah,
honoring.
so beautiful. Okay, I'm gonna not cry. I did tear up, and I'm not embarrassed about it. It's just I'm trying to move on without giving time to that feeling. Um, as a first, thank you so much for this conversation. I will probably ask you to continue it with me publicly or privately. I'm open to all. I think that your insight, your expertise, your education, and your art are helpful and useful and important to the greater conversation about language, about um, literature, about art, and people should have access to it. And I'm going to move on to updates about the Midwest Writing Center, but before, say, the Armenians who are maybe not familiar with the Midwest Writing Center leave the program, I want to say that I think it's next Sunday. I wrote it down. I don't know why I'm not looking at it. Next Sunday, October 8th, the Midwest Writing Center will be collaborating with YALA, the International Armenian Literary Association, for a Writing for Resilience program. This will be a program meant to help folks with all of the horrible feelings that we're having surrounding the ethnic cleansing in Artsakh and the atrocities happening ongoing to our people. So that will be it'll be good to reach out to Yala first, probably, but also you're welcome to message the Midwest Writing Center in whatever way you are comfortable with to get information about that. I'm the person who answers our social media, so I'll be on hand to have answers about how to get involved with that. That'll be a Zoom program. I will be running what our director created some curriculum surrounding writing for mental health. We'll be adapting that to be culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive, and we'll have some Armenian therapists on hand in case anybody needs a little extra care in that time. That will be at 9:30 a.m. California time. I'm not going to do the math on that for what it means on the East Coast or in Yerevan, but that will be open to anyone who wants to be engaged with that space. Now, yes. Yeah, that was my next step, but then I got thrown off. Now to give some space to that, to our history and to our learning that we're doing today, I was hoping to get Tamar to share with us some of her work, both in Armenian and in English, if you don't mind.
Yes, thank you so much.
I got my serious voice on.
I'm gonna read some shorter pieces in both Armenian and English, and then a longer piece I'm just gonna read in the English translation. And 1 second.
I think it's so cool. I had the opportunity at a former job to hear people read in both their native tongue and in English, and I think that it is I think it's a powerful experience, even if you don't understand the other language. There's at least an understanding that happens when you hear it, especially when you're able to also get some of the literal message, but also the vibe in a language that you are familiar with.
I agree, and I think it's very interesting to think about a language, because when we first start hearing a language that we don't quote unquote understand, we search for words that are comparable in the language we understand, and we search for that meaning. And then there's a point that we just let go, and we hear it like a song, and it just like takes over us, and we actually imagine experiencing language for kind of its auditory like levels, and then we just get immersed in something, and we just don't worry about quote unquote understanding the words anymore, but we understand the experience and the essence of it. So yeah, I agree, and I think it's a really interesting experience.
I'm
I
really happy you said quote understand, because I was really trying not to use that word, because it's
yeah.
just, I don't know, it's just not the right word.
Yeah. I also, what was I gonna say? I forgot. Oh, I often wonder what Armenian sounds like because I don't know it as a person who doesn't quote unquote understand it. So I'm always asking people, what does it sound like? Like, what does it sound like to you?
I'm gonna give the worst
Yeah,
most like synesthetic answer, and I'm
yeah,
not synesthetic, so that's not like a real
yeah.
thing. But to me, Armenian
Yes.
sounds like what Plaki smells like.
What smells like?
Plaki? It's like a carrot dish,
Oh yeah, yeah. Okay.
which is a good
In-
thing, but it's also like kind of weird. It's very comforting, but like a little uncomfortable.
Hey, I could see that.
I love that you asked that, because I heard Mongolian poetry read one time, and I
Yeah,
thought it sounded like snow, and I have no way to explain that to anyone
right,
who hasn't just heard it.
right.
But I did say it to the poet, and so I hope that she appreciated that and didn't think I was a big weirdo.
I could totally see how Mongolian smells like snow, actually.
Sounds
I'm
like sounds like.
sounds like yeah, sounds like snow. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean it's quite possible that if you're an Armenian from Anatolia, you have some Mongol in you.
Mhm.
The history of the medieval period. So I would just like to say that I do, but because I just
We're all related to Genghis Khan in
yeah,
schools
we're all
planet.
descendants of Genghis Khan anyway. So um
Yeah, sorry, please take it away.
okay, sure, sure. All right, so here's some poetry, and then I'll move to a longer piece. So ու այդ հին ու փտած նստարանը երկու գնոջ հոգնած ոտքերուն մինակ հանգստության լուծումն է հիմա։ Պետք է սպասեն, միշտ սպասելու վրա են, պիտի ուշանագսին, գրնալալ այսօր չի կասին, գիրագի է, գիտեն, նույնիսկ եթե չի կա, այս պահուն սպասելու խաղը պետք է խաղցվի, քանի մղոն քալելու հարց կա, եթե չի կա, եւ փագմաշտուն գթարնա քովի գնոջ, գերքես կփսպսա, եւ անի իր բայոսագեն գիտարը հանելով կնվակե, որ ան երկե։ The
I'm
decay, oh
so
sorry.
sorry. I'm the worst person to answer that question, because as you read, I am in my grandmother's kitchen. So please, non-Armenians, let us know what Armenian sounds like.
Yeah, that's the question of the day.
Okay, continue. I won't interrupt.
Now the English. The decaying and dilapidated bench is the only solution now to cradle the legs of two tired women. They must wait. There is always this business of waiting. It will be late, they said. It may not come today, they said. It is Sunday, they know. But even if it does not come, now, in this moment, the game of waiting must be played. There is the question of walking miles otherwise. And Pagmashtu turns to the lady beside her. Shall we sing? She sighs. And pulling her guitar from its case, she plays for her so she can sing her songs.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm gonna save my commentary for later, because it's just about my appreciation of Armenian and not useful to other people. Thank you so much, Tamar. I love everything. I love everything.
Thank you.
Um,
I'm very grateful. Thank you.
and please hang out for a minute after.
Okay.
So I'm going to give updates on the Midwest Writing Center. Again, I want to emphasize for any Armenians who are watching this live or in advance of October 8th, we do have that collaboration with the International Armenian Literary Alliance at 9:30 a.m. LA time, which I believe is 8:30 p.m. Yerevan time. I'm not 100% sure. And my cat just laid down on my calendar. So we're gonna improvise the rest of this upcoming events stuff. This Sunday, we will be at Lowland Block Party at Roztalks from 12 to 5. There will be live music all day. Between music sets, we will have readers. We're super excited about that. We're always, of course, very grateful to be part of the Lowland Block Party. There will be vendors, artisans, food, drink. Obviously, Roztalks will be open. That labor space where this is held is between Roztalks and Ragged Records in Rock Island on 3rd Avenue. Then I can't see my calendar.
Cats.
I know, I could just pick it up. Maybe. Yes, okay. Then next week on Write More Light, we will have Alec Hirschman, author of the upcoming release from MWC Press, For a Second in the Dark. This chapbook is really incredible. I have read it a couple of times now. I have to say it's doing some really innovative work and also has a really powerful impact, both linguistically and formally. So he will be on Write More Light on Tuesday, October 3rd. And then he will be here live in person at the Spectral Reading Series at Roztalks on Friday, October 6th. Doors are at 6 p.m. for that event, and we'll have an open mic before our featured readers. Our featured readers include Emily Kingery, Aubrey Ryan, and Sophia Best. All of them have won awards for their chapbooks. All of them are really, really talented writers, and it's going to be a really, really wonderful show. Now, the day before that, Thursday, October 5th, our band book celebration at the Rock Island Public Library, Watts Midtown branch. We're going to have a quick reception with a little bit of food, a little bit of drink at 5:30. Then the reading starts right at 6. We will be, we'll have lots of community members. We've got librarians, we've got teachers, we've got children, we've got, community leaders, we've got normies who will be reading short excerpts from their favorite banned books, and then we'll have a little conversation about why the book was banned and why the book is important. Then we go back to Writer's Studio, our free open workshop critique space on the first and third Saturday of every month. I host the Zoom version, which is again open to anyone from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And we are returning to our in-person group as well, which is totally separate from the online one. Then, we're continuing through the month of October with our Wednesday night free writes for young writers. That's primarily geared toward middle school and high schoolers. We've got open space. We've got lots of literary resources. We'll have some prompts. We'll have some workshopping, and we've got a printer and we've got Wi-Fi. So just come hang out with peers. Hang out with peers. We will be at the Iowa City Book Fest in Iowa City on October 14th. That's pretty much all day. The book fair is where we will be, which is at Merge on the Ped Mall. On October 19th, we are so honored and delighted and thrilled, and I don't have enough praise to give to be hosting Erica Lewis in the Spectral Reading Series. She'll be our featured reader for Spectra for her book, which is of course not sitting next to me. Mahogany, she's on her Mahogany tour, and the opening readers for her will be Melissa Conway, Tutu, and Becca Claver. So it's going to be really, really incredible. That's all of my updates for the month of October, but I hope to see you all. As I already said, hit us up on socials. I'm the one who answers that. And for today's prompt, I hope you give yourself at least 5 minutes to do this free write. I would like you to imagine that the words that you are writing cannot be read, and take the time to read that. And then since I have finished up, I would love to hear more from Tamar.
Okay. Another piece from the book. Օրը անցրևը դեղալեն հետո, երբ մակոցիս այդ լերը, եւ եթե գարենաս հասնի լերան կակատը, այդ լերը մակոցել են հետո, այդ անգարելի եւ անաբադ լերը, հետո հոն պիտի փնտրես գինմը, շունչմը, հոն պիտի լսես ինչպես անցրևը գերազեր քուրքուրանքի մասին, հոն քարերը պիտի պատմեն, ինչպես անցրևը դեղալով մարմին ուզած է հերիվնել եւ որ իրեն փաթուկ մտա հոն պիտի լսես ինչպես անցրևը քարին կդավ եւ որոշեցին ընկեր մնալ հոն պիտի լսես փայլագին շիտ իջնելը հոն պիտի դիտես գայծակը եւ պիտի տեսնես իր արցունքները եւ հետո թունալ պիտի լաս եւ պիտի նայես որ երբ քու արցունքները գտնեն ծարերուն ջուղերը քիրք մը պիտի քրեն եւ թուն երազելով մոր մը քու կրանքին պիտի շուրջդ փնտրես գինմը շունչմը եւ պիտի ընթորինագես ջուղերուն դարերը իր հիշադակին եւ երբ օրմը թուն այս քիրքը գարթաս պիտի տեսնես որ թունես այս գինը So the English. One day, after the heavy rain, when you climb that mountain, and if you can reach its peak after you climb that mountain, that futile and forest of a mountain, then you will search for a woman, an exaltation. And there you will there they will tell you the story of how the rain dreamed about being cuddled. There the rocks will disclose how the rain showering itself searched for a form so she can find a hug. There you will hear the drip drop of the thunder. There you will watch the thunder and see her crying, and then you will cry too. And you will find that when your tears caress the branches of the trees, they will write a book. And you will leave dreaming of a mother's love. You will search for that woman, that exaltation, and you will record the letters of the trees in her memory. And you will find when you read them back again, the book is about you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Here's a little short excerpt again.
Can you,
Yeah,
sorry,
go.
can
Yeah,
you see
please.
where that fits in the book
Yeah, sure.
or how? Maybe not where.
So the book, as I said, is the table of contents on the left is goddesses of the Armenian pantheon.
Mhm.
And on the right is all these periodicals that featured women, either were edited by women or early on featured women writers when it was very uncommon for women to publish in the press. So this would be under Time, Jamanag, and Nar, the goddess Nar, who is the goddess of water in the Armenian pantheon.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Please continue.
Ժամանակը պիտի կա, որ անձրևը պիտի մորնա իր մտադրությունը եւ իր հիշողությունը գործընծնելով իրեն դեղ նոր անձրևը պիտի դեղա եւ այդ անձրևը պիտի ողբա իր անցյալը ամեն գաթիլ մեծ մայրիկը ամեն գաթիլ հոգիմը 1.5 միլիոն հոգի եւ ավելի որ դեղացին անձրևը որ քրեցին անձրևը եւ ուրիշը եւ ուրիշմի ամեն մեկը հույնեն բաժնվող գաթիլը And a time will come that the rain will forget its intention, and losing its memory, a new rain will pour down. And this rain will mourn the past rains, each drop a grandmother, each drop a soul, 1.5 million souls, and more that poured rain, that wrote a rain, and another, each one a drop, an extension of the source. And then this one I'll just read in English. So the book has these little like excerpt writings. And I don't know if you call them scenes, but they're kind of maybe experimental prose, I guess we would say. So I'd like to finish by reading today with this one piece that comes in the section of Astrid and young Armenian woman. I think it comes from that section. There is no right and wrong. There are no emotions. There is only writing. They say that those who are diagnosed with PTSD can help themselves during triggered attacks by doing something detail-oriented, to focus their attention on meticulous acts. Details aren't defects, but completions. The brain is divided into different parts, they teach us, and in those horrid moments of a PTSD attack, they advise you to shift the focus of your brain from the part that rules emotion to the one that rules logic. In these moments, a body that was already a bastard to you becomes even more bastardized, pulverized, petrified to pieces. Like your brain, your body dissipates like fragments, a dark wind coming over you, spreading its rays from your head down to your thighs. And your body must submit until its pulp belongs to a stranger. Every ingredient of your body made foreign, a shrapnel that needs to be sewn back together again, a heart that needs to beat as one again. This is how the doctors explained it to me one day when I tried to explain it to them. My mom always dropped me off at Nani's house. Nani is what I called my grandmother, before the morning sunrise. First things first, Armenian coffee, a cigarette, Armenian string cheese melted in pita bread. Do you want tea today? Yes, Nani. My Nani ran her house like we were living in a 19th century Victorian novel. And during her morning coffee, which she loved to take out in the balcony if the weather permitted, that day's lunch was decided. And then around 11, we would move inside because her program started then. I would read my books when she watched, but my ears would catch things, and I would constantly compare those men in her shows to my Mr. Darcy, of course. I was Elizabeth Benning of Pride and Prejudice. I was going to marry for love and not for money or status. I was an aspiring writer, and writers never marry for money or status. And I knew quite well that these men were not a Mr. Darcy. They were confusing. A wedding happened every day in her shows, and then a breakup. She didn't know English. I'm sure her versions were much different. I'm sure in her version, people did not profess deep love to someone and then turn right around and make out with someone else. I read Pride and Prejudice, waiting for the kiss that Mr. Darcy never gives Elizabeth, even though he loves her. It makes me nervous to be kissed. These lethargic moments passed quickly in the day, and after lunch, it was time for lessons, literature and language, French, then knitting and sewing, which was the most peaceful moment of the day. We knit silently. Nani a sweater, I could barely figure out a short sock. Mine always came out crooked. Move slowly, she would advise, meticulously. Life moves fast enough for us. But then she would knit, and then I would write. And there's no right or wrong, she would say, just write. Details aren't defects, but completions. How many Armenian women have knitted, have written silently, to escape their broken hearts, to forget their trauma, but at the same time to be able to tell their stories, to shift the focus of their brain from the part that rules emotion to the one that rules logic, because the details of emotion were called defects. Nani, did you knit with your grandmother too when you were a kid? I don't remember. I don't remember that much from my childhood. How? I will tell you another day, my darling. I'm not in the mood today. Now show me what you have written. But today we're out of today we're out of the white Armenian string cheese, and so we have to eat the American yellow cheese and pita bread. And there was a small earthquake this morning, and so the news is on, and there will be no other programming. And today Nani knits and I write. And years later, I came to understand that she told her stories through knitting, that she attended to her past by sewing. And why she encouraged me to write, because I could not knit or sew. And she knew that if one day it so happened that I had to find a way to shift the focus of my brain from the part that rules emotion to the one that rules logic, I would have a strategy. I could write a story.
No, I'm the wrong audience, right? I mean, I'm the right audience, but I'm the wrong audience. That's so, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone that tuned in. Thank you for caring about Western Armenian, and thank you for having me on the show to talk about my experience. I'm most grateful.
Thank you so much. And to everyone out there, please write more light into your life.